Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Linda Canada, and I'm with the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego, and we are a partner with the Friends of the Chula Vista Library in creating the exhibition that you're going to see today. This land is your land, this land is my land. And it's about Japanese Americans primarily involved in the farming community here in Chula Vista, and tells a story both before and after World War II. So I'm glad you could come today. I'm going to take you into the museum and explain a few points, but more importantly, you should feel free to look and read and enjoy the exhibit while you're here. Actually, maybe I'll open the door. Before you, there's a beautiful map that's been created by local scholar Steve Shanehair, who looked at census records and tax records and city directories going all the way back to 1905 to identify Japanese and Japanese Americans who lived and farmed here in Chula Vista. And notice that I said Japanese and Japanese Americans. That's for a purpose, because the first group to come here, the people we call the Issei, the first generation, were Japanese nationals, Japanese citizens. But as those men got married and started to have children, the children were born here in the United States and were U.S. citizens and are U.S. citizens, and so they are Japanese Americans, so hence the difference. The green dots on the map indicate where the Japanese farms were here in Chula Vista prior to World War II. As I said, the earliest one in 1905. So they were predominantly in the downtown core areas. Chula Vista was a fairly small community at that point. Census records indicate that there were about 113 family groups here in Chula Vista. Now, family groups means a head of household and dependents. In the case of farmers, often they have very large families because of the need to use the children on the farm and for other purposes. So, although there was 113 family groups, when they were sent away to internment camps, there were about 450 people who actually went from Chula Vista. So they were farming right in the center of town. Of course, once they went away, nobody farmed here in the middle of town, and Chula Vista expanded greatly between the Navy and Rohr. And so when Japanese came back to the area after the war, they couldn't come back to the same areas. You see very few red dots where they used to farm. Instead, they were more in the outlying areas where land was available and also where water supply had been brought in. So we do have a guide so that you can look up names, and you can also look up by location. So let's say you lived in Chula Vista and you remember there was a Japanese farm at the corner of 4th and Date or whatever. You can look it up and see who the farmer was who owned that land. Individual families owned, strike that, operated, because that's an important distinction. They were not allowed by law to own land if they were Japanese citizens. So they rented land and operated farms here in Chula Vista. And let me show you some of the farming equipment that they used.
Now, did any Japanese Americans own land and farm it?
They did. After the war, Japanese Americans owned land. And before the war, there were attempts to put the land in the name of the children.
Of children, right. Mm-hmm.
And of course the government then got wise to that and made a law that said you can't put the land in your children's name either. So yes, there were some attempts to be able to own the land, because of course that's everybody's goal, to control the land that they farm. So let's look at some of the implements that they used. First thing that everybody notices is the replica that we made of a farm stand. Now I say replica because none of them survive, but probably if you lived in this area, you remember them being on the street corners with produce being available for sale. So this one is sort of based on the same Japanese style post-construction, but it was done fairly recently. But what's inside is fairly historic. We've got some lug boxes that were used on the farms here in Chula Vista with the names of some of the Japanese farming families that were here. We've got a 1930s era scale here which still has its tax sticker on it from the 1930s. So it's kind of similar to what you might have seen on a corner. And it's even realistic down to the tin can, which you might not have noticed if I didn't tell you about it, because sometimes the farmers just made this sale by honor system, and so bought what you wanted and you put your money in the can. And we know about this because of some of the wall quotes that are here, and we actually had a woman tell me that this is what her grandmother did on her stand on the street corner. Now there's some unique equipment that's here that you might not otherwise know if you were not a farmer. This has changed over the years, and something similar to this is still used, but it's a lot lighter and a lot safer to use. This is a device that was worn by teenagers, usually boys, on their backs. It's operated by a gas motor, so it would have a gasoline supply, and into the top you would put either fertilizer or pesticides. They had no real protection. They didn't wear masks, they didn't wear gloves, they just went out in the field with this motor strapped to their back with hoses in two hands, blowing the material onto the plants without the gasoline and without the fertilizer or the pesticide. This weighs 50 pounds. So imagine that that's part of your daily chores. Something else of interest, and that the children were involved with, was nailing together the lug boxes that the vegetables and fruits went into. And so in order to do that, they had to grab hold of a bunch of nails and real quick pound them in and create a box out of just slats of wood. Well, this little guy makes it possible for you not to have to plunge your hand into a jar of nails and hurt yourself by sticking yourself over and over again. If you pour your nails into the top of this little device, they slide down grooves and they all end up with their points down, so you can then grab them out of the stack and nail those boxes really easily. This was one of the tasks that the younger kids on the farm could do. Sometimes the dad would pay them for this. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they got a thank you. Japanese farmers made many innovations in farming here in Chula Vista, and one of the things that it was unique at the time, and you may not recognize it because the iteration has changed over the years, is the paper, what looks like a hat in the corner. That's what's called a hot cap. And they took various shapes, but the idea was that you made a cap to put over a young seedling plant. And the edges are turned up at the bottom so that the child, usually the children would place them over the little seedlings. The child would then scuff some dirt into that trough at the bottom in order to hold it in place. The benefit was that this protected the seedling from the sun, but it also trapped moisture there so that the seedling would hopefully grow faster and better. And for farmers, the first farmer to market usually gets the highest price for the materials. So this was an innovation that they started, and you see it now, even today, but now you see long tube-like strips of plastic over the fields, but it's the same concept that was started here. And then some of the implements in our case are implements that were actually used on the farms here in Chula Vista. But let me tell you about what the major crop was here in Chula Vista.
Okay, I know you stopped, but what
Yes.
about this rake over there? Is that a rake?
That is a handmade rake, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So many of the farmers had forges on their on the farm, and so we've actually got one in our collection. So they would have the anvil, and they would hammer these things out and recycle pieces of other things in order to, you know, make new tools to use on the farm. And in fact, if you look at some of our tools here, you'll see that wooden handles and parts have been replaced in order to keep them useful on the farm. The title of the exhibition, of course, is "This Land is Your Land, This Land is My Land." And why that title? Well, there was a little controversy about Chula Vista and Japanese farmers, and that history is portrayed here as well. The farmers rented the land. The families often were large and worked on the land. And the Caucasian farmers felt that the Japanese had an unfair advantage because they had all this free labor that could work. So there was some dissent back and forth, and several court cases and several things occurred. And I will let you read the panels, but let me tell you that Chula Vista was a hotbed of anti-Japanese sentiment for quite a while. It was resolved before Pearl Harbor happened. But there's an interesting history to that involves Mr. Stafford and other people here in Chula Vista that you can read about. The big crop here for the farmers of Japanese descent was celery. Winter celery in particular. Celery in the early part of the 20th century was a popular vegetable to have on the table. Every dinner table had pickles and olives and celery. And it was so popular that specific dishes, in the case here there is a cut glass dish with kind of a wavy top, and that is known as a celery dish. And so the stalks were set upright and artistically in this dish on the dinner table. Celery was the second most money-producing crop here in Chula Vista in the 1930s, second only to citrus production. So celery was grown by everybody, and there were farming cooperative groups that got together to help transport the celery to market and, you know, make sure they got top dollar. So celery was really the king. Chula Vista was known as the celery capital of the world. Now, things were going fairly well here in Chula Vista through the late 1930s, and then Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. And the barbed wire dividing our case here really indicates the dividing line that changed everything for people of Japanese descent all over the West Coast, not just here in Chula Vista. The United States government decided that Japanese citizens and American citizens of Japanese descent were a danger to the United States and needed to be moved away from the West Coast. And President Roosevelt signed an executive order in February of 1942 that allowed for the people to be removed forcibly from their homes. So where you had a thriving Japanese and Japanese American farming community here in Chula Vista in late March of 42, by April 8th of 1942, you had no one left of Japanese descent here. Overnight, they were taken away to camps and separated from the things that they'd been doing for many years here in Chula Vista. Let me show you what a sample room in that camp would look like. So what you're looking at is a 2-scale model of a barracks room in an internment camp, and this particular one was built by the friends and family of Frank Wada, who is a local man who thought it was important that people see what this actually looked like. So you notice it's all built of wood, and at the time it was built, this lumber was green lumber. It had not been aged, so that meant that as it sat in the hot desert sun of Poston, Arizona in this case, in the 115 to 120 degree heat, that lumber dried out fairly quickly, leaving the large gaps that you see on the floor. And you also notice tin can lids on the floor. That's to keep the scorpions and snakes and bugs and other critters from crawling up through the knot holes, because as the wood dried out, the knots fell down to the bottom, leaving these gaping holes. So this is how people lived, and up to 6 people would live in a barracks like this. The Sagawa family, a local family here, had 10 kids, so they got 2 rooms. They had luxurious accommodations. We've only shown 1 cot here, but remember, there would have been 6 here for people to sleep in. Now you notice there's no bathroom facilities, there's no cooking facilities. That's because these camps were set up in such a manner that there were central mess halls, there were central restrooms, shower facilities, there were laundry rooms and ironing rooms, and so this is where people lived basically from 1942, late in the year in 42, some of them as long as until 1945. Some of the men, starting in 1943, were able to enlist in the U.S. military. At the time of Pearl Harbor and immediately thereafter, our Japanese American United States citizens were classified as enemy aliens, ineligible to serve in the U.S. Army. Even though they wanted to serve and were willing to serve, they were not allowed to serve. In 1943, things changed, mainly because the U.S. was suffering an awful lot of casualties in both fronts. And so Japanese American men were not only actively recruited, but they were drafted. out of the camps to go serve in the United States military. And they served in a segregated unit with Caucasian officers, enlisted men coming from all of the camps, coming from another group from Hawaii that joined in, and they all served together, mainly in the European theaters, in France, in Italy. Very few were selected for something separate and different because these few had Japanese language skills. And they were recruited into the military intelligence service, and they were actually sent to the war in the Pacific, where the enemy was the Japanese, and these men were asked to infiltrate and listen to and translate what the Japanese were saying about what their plans were to attack the American forces. So a very dangerous position. So today, within the Japanese American community, the men, and it was almost all men who served in these two capacities, the men are really revered for the types of selfless acts that they took while their families were still held in an American concentration camp, basically. So you can see a uniform and some other artifacts relating to the service that we honor by Japanese American men today. Women did serve, but like most military in those years, they were allowed to be nurses, secretaries, and other low-level positions, so they did not have any combat status. Things changed eventually. The Chula Vistans and other Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the camps. Initially, they couldn't come back to the West Coast. Finally, they were allowed to come home. Some were afraid to come home. They didn't know what acceptance they would find, what difficulties they might have. It was not an easy transition to come back. Housing was in short supply. The farms had already been either built upon or taken over by other people, so there wasn't much to come back to, and many people had to start over completely. And that was accepted. They weren't happy about it, but it was something that you just did. So that's another characteristic of Japanese Americans who lived during this time, is that they just, the kids would say they sucked it up, you know, they just did what they had to do to survive and to come back and to be successful once again. So today in San Diego County, we have about 20,000 people who self-identify as being of Japanese descent. Here in Chula Vista, you have a large community of what we call the Shin Issei, or the new Issei, the people who have come after World War II to work in the maquiladoras and in other high-tech industries, and they live here more in the eastern parts of your county. Farming by Japanese farmers in Chula Vista, almost all done with. I think there's one more strawberry grower who sells strawberries down here, but it's pretty much a thing of the past. But historically, you had a lot of farming that went on here. Very successful farming by a group that was really part of your community before the war and came back to a different community, but is part of the community once again. So I want to thank you for coming. We're going to turn on a video for you to look at here to give you some ideas about how the U.S. government talked about the Japanese in their wartime marketing film, and also so you can see some actual footage of what the camps look like. I'll be out in the front. I'll answer questions for you. There are some items you may want to take home with you. We have books to purchase and magnets and other things, and I just want to thank you so much for coming today. And please come back. There's a lot to see here at the Chula Vista Heritage Museum. Thank you.